You're listening to Past Imperfect, a history podcast brought to you by the Center for Wisdom and Leadership at SPJIMR. I'm Dinyar Patel. Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay was someone who has been described as the most important Indian woman leader of the 20th century. Like Jawaharlal Nehru, she saw Indian affairs through a global prism. Like Rabindranath Tagore, she blended politics with culture and art. Today, I'm joined by Nico Slate, the author of Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, The Art of Freedom, a new biography of this most extraordinary personality. Kamaladevi's politics was shaped by both gender and youth, but she also transcended these, leaving an imprint on everything from rural handicrafts promotion to the UN Human Rights Commission. Above all, she spoke her mind, unafraid of challenging British colonial rule, other anti-colonial leaders, or the government of independent India. Thank you, Nico, for joining us today to talk about your new biography on Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay. Your book does a really incredible job of explaining all the different facets of Kamaladevi's career, someone who's been called the most important Indian woman leader of the 20th century, and someone who forged multiple different political agendas, whether it is thinking about India and the world, whether it's thinking about gender, socialism. Her political life began when she was around the age of 16 and continued until her death when she was 85. And she was, in many ways, ahead of her times when we think about ideas like both socialism and feminism. In spite of all of this, it's quite remarkable how so little is known about Kamaladevi and her politics. Why is this so, and why has so little been written about her?
Well, first of all, Dinyar, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about Kamaladevi and this book. It was, for me, a deeply personal project because I came to Kamaladevi very early on in my own career as a historian, and pretty much everything I've written from my dissertation onwards was shaped in one way or another by her life and her inspiration. So even though this is the first book I've written about her, I dedicated a previous book to her. I've written on her in almost every other work I've had. It's a very meaningful and very personal project for me. So I'm grateful for the chance to talk about it, and especially to talk about it with you. You ask a great question about why she hasn't been recognized to the degree that she deserves. And I think the answer depends in part on which part of the world we're talking about. I'm in the United States, and here I think, sadly, many very important Indian figures are understudied and underknown. Kamaladevi is just one of many who deserve to be far better known, right? So that's just American ignorance. And I think to some degree that holds in most other parts of the world outside of India. Within India, I think there's a different story because, of course, within India, there are certain communities that continue to hold Kamaladevi in high esteem. I'm thinking of folks in the craft and arts worlds, for example, for whom Kamaladevi remains a deeply important figure. But I agree with you that even within India, her reputation isn't as wide or as deep as it should be. And I think there's at least a couple reasons for this. One is because of the peculiar trajectory, if you will, of her own career. She was deeply involved in all of the major political episodes of the anti-colonial struggle, but then after independence became much more focused on art and craft, which she, of course, understood as intimately connected to the political. But many people, I think, saw it as a sideshow, that it was something different from the most important issues of the day. And even those people and activists who were in many ways continuing on her trajectory, I'm thinking of many important feminists and women activists in the 70s and 80s, saw Kamaladevi at the end of her life as somewhat of a conservative figure, somewhat of a moderate figure. So I think the disconnect between early Kamaladevi, who's this fiery radical who's involved in pretty much everything going on, and the later Kamaladevi, who saw herself as still very involved, and I think she was still very involved in many important issues of politics and economics and development broadly understood. But there was something different there that was happening there. She was less connected, less centrally important. And I think that has had a lasting impact on the way that she's been understood and received, even within India.
It's important to remember also, I mean, she was active until she died in the year 1988. I mean, it's quite remarkable to think. I mean, you and I are, I guess, no longer really young, but we remember. We remember the year 1988, right? I mean, this is something that's within the living memory of people in our generation. someone
Yes.
who was so intimately involved in the freedom movement in India and had a lasting global impact, whether it's crafts, whether it is feminism, whether it's socialist ideas. She's a very recent political figure as well.
Yes, absolutely. No, you're right. And her life connects the pre 1947 and post 1947 Indias in ways that many historians have failed to do. Right? I mean, it's something that is increasingly um, uh, being recognized as a problem and being addressed. But for a long time, we had lots of books on the anti-colonial struggle that ended in 1947, and then very little on the post-independence period. And what was written on post-independence tended to focus on that period. But what Kamaladevi's life allows us to do is to really link what's happening in the 20s, 30s, and 40s with what's happening in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s.
Hmm. Hmm. That's a good point. So Kamala Devi was a pioneer of something called intersectionality, the linking together of so many different causes, especially progressive causes, which we can see today in politics in places like the United States, India, and many other countries. What exactly was Kamala Devi's own brand of intersectionality, and how did that intersectionality evolve over time?
Mm. This question really cuts to the heart of the book and to the heart of Kamaladevi's life. So I really appreciate it, and I'll try not to talk for 3 days. Uh, Kamaladevi's own personal life was shaped by an interesting mixture of privilege and struggle. In some ways, she's born into a very privileged position as a high caste, relatively affluent, member of the Saraswat Brahmin community. But from a very early age, when her father dies and much of the money goes to a male relative rather than to her mother and her sisters, she becomes very aware of gender inequity and the way that's playing out for her. When she's widowed as a child, she has to confront the way in which many widows at that time, especially higher caste, more elite young girls, were forced to seclude themselves from society. And she's fortunate enough to be shielded from that both by her mother and her father in law, but she's still keenly aware of the deep inequities that face women in many different contexts of Indian life at that period of time. So she has this interesting mix of economic and to some degree social privilege with gender inequity. And I think that from an early age, that shapes her understanding of the way that all of us are bound together across multiple forms of identity. We're not just defined by our nationality or by our religion or by our class status or by our gender or by our race. All of these things intersect and overlap, and our societies are made up of these overlapping forms of hierarchy and privilege. And so from an early age, Kamaladevi recognized that, and to her credit, fought not just against the forms of inequity that directly impacted her, so in this case, sexism, but also fought against forms of inequity that impacted other people, particularly class and issues of race and racial inequity. If and when we have time, we can talk more about the more complicated ones. Religion and caste are more
Hmm.
complicated for Kamaladevi, but
Of
certainly she
course.
becomes an extremely important and outspoken critic of gender inequity, class inequity, and somewhat unusually, racial inequity. She becomes a very important and outspoken critic of racism across the globe. Now, that I think comes out of her own personal life, but it's also about the incredibly wide view that Kamaladevi has of the world. She's a voracious reader, so she learns a lot from reading. And then from fairly early on in her life, she starts to travel. She goes to Europe and then later ends up traveling pretty much all across the world. And I think her voracious reading habits and her travel also contribute to her understanding of intersectionality, because she comes to see very directly the way that different forms of injustice and inequity impact people in different parts of the world. So when she's in India, she's very focused on issues of gender and class. But when she comes to the United States, she speaks out very openly about issues of race, because that was, the primary form of inequity at that time and place. So she's learning from her own experience. She's learning from her reading. She's learning from her travels. And what she comes to is, I think, one of the most profound intersectional visions of a truly just world, of a truly democratic world, one that continues to have deep resonance, not just in India, but in the United States and throughout the world.
So you've spoken about gender, and clearly, so much of her politics was derived from her interest in women's affairs. Reading your book, the other thing that really strikes me is her youth and the fact that during so much of her active political career in the Congress Party, she was incredibly young. I mean, she was
Yes.
under the age of 30 when she already, had become a prominent national figure. And so many of her political activities in the 1920s and 1930s are with youth organizations or youth movements. So I want to ask you, how do both youth and gender define her politics, and how does she also try to transcend these? And I know you spoke a bit about how race and class were, other elements of her political thought.
I really appreciate this question, Daniel, because it's something that I myself was surprised by as I dug into her archive. Again and again and again, she's going to speak at youth conferences, youth rallies, youth movements of various sorts. And it was just a blind spot in my own historical knowledge. I wasn't aware of how important generational solidarities and conceptions of youth were to the anti-colonial struggle in the
Mm.
1920s, 30s, and into the 40s. And it really did shape Kamaladevi and her vision of the world. She understood herself, as did many of her peers, as being part of a turning tide of a new generation that was going to not just win India's freedom, but redefine what freedom meant. And I think it directly fed into her radicalism, the degree to which she didn't just want to get rid of the British, but keep the essence of British rule. She wanted to fundamentally transform Indian society. And she fought tooth and nail against many of the older, more established, more conservative figures, within the Congress movement, even while maintaining overall amicable relationships with them. This is one of, I think, the remarkable stories, not just of Kamaladevi, but really of the Indian freedom movement, is that you have a movement that contains a tremendous range of different viewpoints and different political strategies and visions. And yet, in the end of the day, many of these figures are able to find their way back together. So, Kamaladevi's relationship with Gandhi, of course, is the most intriguing, I think, and rich one. But similarly with Patel, many other key older Congress figures, Kamaladevi is often a thorn in their side, a gadfly, someone who's pressuring them to take more radical stances on land redistribution, on the movement in the princely states, on issues of gender and sexuality. And sometimes this can lead to outright arguments that spill out into the press. It can become a very public affair. Sometimes it's about internal debates. But Kamaladevi is definitely advancing what she sees and many others see as a younger generation's view of the Indian freedom movement. You ask about the relationship between youth and gender. And there too, I think it's actually important to recognize that within the Indian women's movement, Kamaladevi is, at least for the first 2 decades of her political life, one of the youngest figures to have importance on the national stage. And there too, she combines her youth with a sense of radicalism to push the Indian women's movement towards having a more radical stance, not just on sexism and patriarchy, but also on colonialism and British rule. Right, there are many figures within the Indian women's movement in those years who feel like it should be a single focus movement, right? That they should just focus on gaining greater rights for women and not confuse things by taking on issues of colonialism or socialism or other issues. And of course, there's this long, you know a lot about this, Danielle, but this long, complicated dynamic in which the British themselves used issues of gender to try to assert their own importance, right? And in
Of
order to
course.
try to suggest that they were there to help advance India's society. And it's complicated for someone like Kamaladevi, who wants to fight against sexism and patriarchy, but doesn't want to provide fuel for the British in order to prolong their rule. And I think it's important to see her stance as something of a youth stance. The younger members of the movement are those saying, look, if we really want to end sexism and patriarchy, we have to end colonialism too, and we have to end class inequity, and we have to fight against racial inequity. We have to do all of these things at the same time. And I've always found it striking, actually. Kamaladevi is almost always the odd one out. In women's movements, she's the radical socialist who's fighting for anti-colonialism. In Congress meetings, she's often one of the lone powerful female voices. Even among the socialists, she's one of the few women who's trying to fight to bring gender and issues of gender inequity into focus. So she's always swimming against the tide in some ways. And I think it's one of the things I admire about her, but I also do associate that to some degree with just the fact that she sees herself as part of this younger generation.
In that sense, I think it's kind of appropriate. She was born in the 20th century, right? In the sense that,
Yes.
she's one of the few people in the 20s and 30s in the Congress who actually was born in the century that they were waging their political campaign.
Yeah.
So on the topic of youth, I want to turn to Kamaladevi's childhood and adolescence. And there seem to be two key turning points in her life, both which seem to shatter a lot of taboos. At the age of 11, you write in your book, she was married in her hometown of Bangalore, but her husband passed away within a year. But her family, nevertheless, was insistent that Kamaladevi not live the rest of her life as a widow in solitude, which was still, of course, very commonly practiced in that era. And instead pursue her education. And that, I guess, really sends shockwaves both within the community, right, the Saraswat Brahmin community, and also, sets herself up on a life of breaking certain taboos.
Yes, absolutely. And I give both her mother and her former husbands, the boy that she's married to, his father, are both very progressive members of that community, and they both speak out for her and defend her right to continue her education. And it does, as you said, shape her in at least two ways. One is that it early on brands her as something of a rebel, and it also provides her the means to continue to advance her own education and her own development. And that, of course, then leads directly to the next big taboo breaking moment, which I expect you're going to ask about in a minute. But that, her education takes her from Mangalore, which is a city, but a relatively sleepy city, to the great city of Madras, right now, Chennai. And it's there that she meets her next husband and breaks those taboos again.
Mm-hmm. So, if you could talk a bit about that, I mean, the man she meets obviously comes from a different community, a very different milieu.
Yes. So the Chattopadhyayas are amongst India's most dynamic and storied families at that moment of time, deeply enmeshed in cultural production of various sorts, deeply involved in the avant-garde in various contexts. And Harindranath is already at that point fairly well known as a poet and an actor and someone who is seen as a very dynamic figure. He and Kamaladevi meet in the sort of upper class world of Madras. Kamaladevi is friends with several of his sisters, and they fall in love. Now, from very early on, I think it's something of a one-sided relationship in the degree that Harindranath is never one to hone in on one romantic partner. From very early on, he's known as a philanderer who's having multiple relationships at the same time. I think Kamaladevi does very sincerely fall in love with him, at least at the outset. But I think she's also attracted to some degree to the larger world that he's a part of. By marrying Harindranath, she marries not just this very dynamic young man, but she also marries into a world of art parties and cultural events, and she fights to be fully a part of that world. I mean, one of my favorite details of her life, really, in the grand scheme of things, but it was very important, is that when she marries Harendranath, not long thereafter, she learns that he's made plans to go study in the UK and that it's expected that she'll remain behind in India. And she'll have nothing to do with that plan. She rejects the idea of staying in India and instead travels herself to the UK in order to pursue her own studies. So she fights to be fully a part of his life and of the opportunities that offers for her. But from just the very fact that she remarries and remarries across the lines of community to the fact that she is willing to travel to the UK to pursue her own education, she's breaking the boundaries one half to the other, and it's the kind of boundary breaking that then creates for her the hunger to do it again. Right? I mean, this is part of the power of refusing to be bounded as a young person, is that she then learns more. She's introduced to greater and more interesting worlds, including meeting Harendranath's older brother, most often known as Chatto, the famous radical. So, whereas Harendranath is engaged with politics, but I think is more of a poet and an actor than anything else. His family is deeply involved in the freedom struggle and deeply involved in certain socialist radical politics in ways that have a huge impact on Kamaladevi. So she breaks these boundaries and then is radicalized in the process of breaking them, and her world becomes increasingly, for her, exciting, and she becomes increasingly important to that world.
So you talk about in your book about how, by marrying into the Chattopadhyay family, she expands her boundaries in an incredible way, right? I mean, she gets a sister-in-law, Sarojini Naidu, who knows Gandhi, works with people like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, knew Gokhale very well. So, automatically in kind of the first rung of the nationalist leadership of the time. You talked about Chatto, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, who, was a Europe-based radical who eventually is killed during Stalinist purges. So you have people, who are really, on the frontiers of political developments, not just in India and abroad. But at the same time, this family could seem to be quite domineering and could, have almost like a suffocating influence upon Kamaladevi and her career and her personal life as well.
Yes, no, that's true. And that will remain a challenge for her throughout much of her life. I think it's a testament to her that she's strong enough to not be fully controlled by the Chattopadhyay family. But it's not easy because they are extremely powerful figures with a strong sense of what Harendranath's wife should be like. And so Kamaladevi has to fight back against that, and she fights back early on in deciding that she's going to go to the UK to study, and then she fights it again when she has their child, their son Ram, in deciding that she's going to continue to stay actively involved in politics of various sorts. Now, Harendranath could easily be a villainous figure because of his affairs. He has problems with alcohol. In many ways, he's a terrible husband and a terrible father. But Kamaladevi never saw him as entirely a villain, and I think it's important to recognize why. Even later in life, they maintain something of an amicable relationship. And I don't want to defend him in the least. He doesn't deserve a lot of defense. But I will say that he is, especially early on in their relationship, an important figure in defending her political activism, her involvement in the movement. He's not the kind of husband who's going to tell her you have to stay home with our child. He's actually very excited to collaborate with her. They perform on the stage, travel around India doing shows that aim to stir up social consciousness. So there is a certain partnership, and I find it interesting actually that although she barely mentions him at all in her memoir, it's a very interesting choice. When she does mention him, she mentions him as a colleague, as a partner on the stage and in politics, and I think that was an important element of their relationship. So the Chattopadhyay family on the whole is very complicated for her. As you said, it empowers her to have suddenly all these doors open. And a figure like Sarojini Naidu is both a tremendous supporter at many key junctions in her life. I mean, Sarojini Naidu plays a very important role in bringing Kamaladevi into a position of leadership in the All India Women's Conference, the most important organization for Kamaladevi for much of her early life. Sarojini is a very important supporter, but then also um, plays a much more complicated role when it comes time for Kamaladevi and Haran to separate. When Kamaladevi files for divorce, this is something Sarojini Naidu strongly opposes, and there's a lot of tension at that point. So Sarojini Naidu is a complicated figure. The other sisters are also complicated figures, and Haran himself is deeply, deeply complicated for Kamaladevi. But I think early on, he plays a supporting role that helps her find her own independent role in their relationship and within the family. And I think that gives her enough strength that then later on, she's too powerful and too strong to be controlled. Right? Once she finds her full footing, which doesn't take long. At that point, even the most powerful family out there wouldn't be able to really box her in. Nobody could, Dinyar. I mean, this is one of the things I just love about Kamaladevi. She refuses to be boxed in. She refuses to be bounded. She has too strong a sense of her own willpower and too strong a sense of her own curiosity about the world and her interests in exploring and being all of who she can be.
So not long after her marriage, I mean, we think about when you mentioned about not being boxed in. I mean, she gets another huge opportunity opened up to herself in the sense that she is introduced to Gandhian politics, right? And she participates, in some Gandhian activities, and she has a relationship with Gandhi from that moment up until Gandhi's assassination in 1948. But as you mentioned in your book, and as I think you mentioned a short while ago, it was very complex, right? In the sense that she was not afraid to oppose Gandhi or let him know of her disagreements. And your book has a very telling quote where Kamaladevi remarks that she was, quote, not one of those Bapu worshipping females who loll comfortably in their armchairs, end quote. Where did Kamaladevi's ideas converge and diverge from Gandhi's?
Oh, what wonderful questions you're asking me, Dinya. So as you know, I am something of a Gandhi devotee myself, if you will. I recognize the complexities of the man, but I find him endlessly fascinating, and there's so many things I learned from him. Yeah. Well, and so this is one of the dynamics that was most fun for me personally, is to be able to look at Gandhi through the lens of Kamaladevi, someone who knew him intimately well, worked with him very closely. And one could argue, and I actually to some degree make this argument, that in the post-independence period, Kamaladevi is one of the most important Gandhians. She's advancing his ideas in a variety of really important ways. And yet she's never a disciple. She never hews entirely to a Gandhian worldview, and she's never shy about voicing her disagreements with him directly. So you ask, where do they align and where do they not align? Maybe I'll start with where they don't align. And that shifts over time because, and I give him credit for this, Gandhi changes his own views in important ways over time and becomes more aligned with Kamaladevi on both on issues of, of class to some degree, certainly on issues of gender. The most famous flashpoint in the book is when Kamaladevi challenges him on his limited vision of women's participation in the Salt Satyagraha. He wants women to be involved, but he doesn't want them on the Salt March. He doesn't want them directly confronting the police in any form of direct nonviolent civil disobedience. He wants them picketing liquor shops and etc. So he has a vision for women's role, but it's a limited one. Kamaladevi, along with several other women, directly challenge him on this, and he is convinced and changes his viewpoint and opens the Salt Satyagraha fully to all women's participation. And Kamaladevi herself then becomes a key figure in the movement, particularly in Mumbai, and is eventually arrested. So on gender, I'd say they start off in different viewpoints, but she pulls him towards a more progressive view. Never as far as she is, but she pulls him in I think, the right direction. Similarly, on issues of class, on issues of the princely states, he's much more cautious and conservative. Kamaladevi is one of the most outspoken figures, along with Lohia and a few others. She really makes it one of her key causes to fight against the authoritarianism and the inequities of the princely states. and challenges Gandhi very directly on that, and eventually pulls him in her direction. So there's a lot of key differences where Kamaladevi is pulling him in the right way, I'd say, or at least in towards her more progressive dimension. But there are also some key similarities. So one of them is that from very early on, Kamaladevi is deeply moved by the way in which Gandhi embodies his politics,
Hmm.
and it has a vision for India's economic development that is based on local forms of handmade products. Khadi cloth being the most famous example. This is deeply resonates with Kamaladevi, which I find quite interesting because it sets her apart from many of her socialist colleagues. Not all of them, but many of them. She's less interested in huge industrial development and is much more focused on small scale, community based forms of economic growth, really steeped for her in the arts and crafts movement, which she sees both as an aesthetic good, but also as a very important social and economic good. And so, Gandhi's view of small scale village based development is one that Kamaladevi becomes an extremely important proponent of, and they come together on that even before his death. They're also aligned in their view of partition. Kamaladevi is one of the most outspoken opponents of partition, uh, as of course was Gandhi, and really pushes him, tries to get him to be an even more fierce critic, to do even more to try to oppose partition. So there's a lot of similarities, especially towards the end of Gandhi's life. I think Kamaladevi has become, one of the closest key figures to how he envisions India's future. And after his death, she's going to continue to advance those causes, maybe with one important exception, which I find interesting, and personally I find fun to think about where we should all end up on this, which is, yeah, Kamaladevi doesn't have much of Gandhi's ascetic strain. So
Right.
although she's very
You mentioned
interested
that in the
in,
book.
yeah, she's very interested in small scale development and in handwork of various sorts. She doesn't believe in wearing white khadi cloth all the time. She loves colorful saris. She loves jewelry. She loves delicious food. She's not going to fast, in the way that Gandhi would. So that ascetic strain never touches her. And in that way, she's much more inspired by Tagore. She's more of inspired by that legacy of embracing the full richness of beauty within Indian culture in terms of art and dress and food, etc. So that I think is it's a nice balancing point, right, to the sort of Gandhi Tagore spectrum, if you will. I think Kamaladevi kind of adds a nice balancing point where she draws in some ways from one figure and in some ways from the other.
Reading what you had written about Kamala Devi's relationship with Gandhi, I was reminded a lot of another woman leader who I've done a little bit of research on, which was Khurshid bin Naroji, who you mentioned in your book. And Khurshid bin Naroji was, first of all, the granddaughter of Dadabai Naroji, and she also became a Gandhian leader. And she also kind of rejected some of these ascetic qualities of Gandhi's political philosophy and economic philosophy. I mean, she and her sisters, for example, when they were in charge of weaving khadi cloth and such, they made sure to have embroidered patterns, things that would appeal to elite, Bombay residents and such. And at the same time, she was deeply critical of Gandhi at some times. She wrote these scathing letters to Gandhi around the time of just before the Quit India movement. I mean, unlike Kamala Devi, she didn't make this public. And I think Kamala Devi, in many ways, pushed the envelope much more with Gandhi than Khurshid Ben did. But nevertheless, it's reflective of, I think, something important you've identified here, which is, the fact that Gandhi was influenced and pushed by so many women leaders throughout his career, and many of his political stances were based on pressures and influences of women colleagues.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Which is first and foremost testament to the importance of those women leaders, and urges
Absolutely.
us to, yeah, try to remedy their relative exclusion from the historical narrative. I think it is vital for future scholars and for the broader public to recognize more of these women and their importance to the story of India's freedom and India's development. And it also reminds us to give some respect and appreciation for Gandhi, because although he had complicated views and there's certainly patriarchal strains in him, if you look at his relationship with his own wife, it's very complicated, but he grows and changes over time. And he is also, in many ways, uh, very keen to empower women as important agents. So this is a topic's been written on. The Gandhian side of it has been written on by many smart and important people, but I still find it fascinating. But I think the in bringing more of those key women into the main narrative is a very important thing.
So you talked a little bit about her role in convincing Gandhi to allow women into more avenues of work during the Salt Satyagraha. The civil disobedience movement and the Salt Satyagraha movement was in many ways, where she really, was pushed into the front rank of Congress leaders. She, as you talk about in your book, she was involved in leading raids on salt works, such as the Wadala salt works. I'm living not far away from where those salt works are. She was involved in, a lot of nitty-gritty work as well, whether it was selling packets of contraband salt in places like the Bombay High Court or the Share Bazaar. How did Kamaladevi leave her own particular stamp on the civil disobedience movement? And how, in turn, did the civil disobedience movement change Kamaladevi?
The first part of your question, how did she leave her stamp, leads us back to the key role of intersectionality in Kamaladevi's life. I think her main contribution to the movement, and she certainly wasn't alone in this, but she was one of the most important figures who was fighting to create a broad-based movement. And that meant, first and foremost, trying to bring working class people and labor unions more firmly into the Congress fold and more firmly on the side of the struggle. And she's working in Mumbai, then Bombay, one of the key industrial centers in the country, one with a very strong left orientation, very fierce labor unions. And she's trying to make the case that it's in the best interests of workers to fight with the Congress to gain India's independence, and at the same time to push the Congress towards having a more radical stance on capitalist inequity. So that's her main contribution. She's also, like many others at the time, focused on fighting against, you know, religious extremism, trying to bridge the divide between Hindus and Muslims in particular, but also other religious communities. She's, of course, as we talked about earlier, demonstrating in her own person and also fighting for the rights of women to be active leaders in the movement. So she's trying to build an intersectional movement. She's trying to build a salt struggle and a freedom struggle that involves everyone across lines of class, caste, religion, gender, etc., and in the service of a vision of Indian freedom that will be similarly inclusive. So that's her contribution. In terms of the impact on her, I'd say a couple things. So first of all, this is the moment in time in her life when she really, I think, is forced to realize that she has to sacrifice very deeply and personally her own family life for the struggle. I mean, she's made sacrifices already in her life earlier. She's gone to jail already earlier, for example, but not. But at this point, her son is older, at an age where it's much harder for her to be gone. He's not a baby anymore, and she has to go through very painful episodes of having to say goodbye to her son and then being whisked off to jail, not knowing how long she'll be in jail. There's a lot of uncertainty about how the movement will play out for her personally, and that uncertainty is it would be hard for anyone, of course, but is especially hard for someone who is in many ways a single mother, right? Harin is out of the country, gallivanting about with another woman at this point. He's never been a good father. So Kamaladevi knows if she's taken out of the picture, right, her son is not going to have either parent around, right? There are, of course, other family members who will and do help raise him, but that's a deeply difficult decision for her to make, but it's one that she makes. She knows that she has to make those sacrifices because she's called to dedicate her life to this struggle.
So you mentioned Harin, and that's precisely what I wanted to talk about next. Because while she's doing this, while she's courting arrest in Bombay, and later while she's in prison, right, and suffering some pretty terrible treatment in prison, her husband Harin is abroad in the United States and embarks upon an affair with an American woman who actually identified as an Indian, Ragini Devi, a famous dancer who herself is also married. And I mean, we knew that Harin was not the best of husbands. I mean, you had talked about his many indiscretions, but over here he runs off with a married woman, and this woman becomes pregnant, and it's splashed all over the news thanks to Ragini Devi's husband, and it embroils Kamaladevi in a great deal of controversy, and she ultimately takes the momentous decision, this moment, to divorce. And divorce, worldwide at this point, right, in the early 1930s, is not very lightly indulged in, and in a country like India, even more so. So, how was her decision to divorce Harin in keeping with her political principles and her ideas of gender equality?
This is one of the most dramatic moments in her life. And I think her decision to divorce Haran is bound up with her fight for the freedom, not just of India as a country, but the fight for the freedom and independence of Indian women. And then Kamaladevi sees this marriage as increasingly a shackle, as increasingly a form of of colonial rule, if you will, in which
Mm,
she's being confined and constrained and really mistreated by this man who is um, having serial affairs in ways, as you just noted, that were deeply public. Who's also, in many ways, abandoning their son, and when he does show up, can play a very divisive role with the son. So there's a strong tie for Kamaladevi between her decision to divorce Haran and her fight for the freedom and independence of Indian women. They're both acts of principled resistance to forms of inequity and injustice. It's not an easy decision. It's actually a
mm,
very difficult decision for her. And some of it is her worries about how it will impact her son. Some of it is her worries about how it will impact her own political career because there's fierce resistance. As I mentioned earlier, Sarojini Naidu is deeply opposed to the divorce, goes directly to Gandhi and
mm,
spreads rumors that already exist about how Kamaladevi wants to divorce Haran because she wants to have her own affairs. There's all sorts of rumors at play here. And she's imprisoned at the time. It's amazing. She has to be transported from one jail all the way across India to participate in the divorce proceedings before being transported back. And as you noted, that is one of the hardest periods of her jail going. She's in solitary confinement in
mm,
very
mm.
difficult conditions. But
This was
it's
in Vellore, right?
in
When
Vellore,
when
exactly, yes, and it's a decision that she never regrets, to my knowledge. I didn't find any record in. Of course, she's very private, so there isn't much about her marriage in the record anyway. But there's very little evidence that she regretted the decision to divorce. I think it was one that she struggled with, decided upon, and then embarked upon. But as I said earlier, she maintains somewhat warm relationships with Haran. She's a very forgiving person. And you mentioned Rajani Devi. That is one of my favorite episodes of the book, where this American woman who's passing as an Indian dancer shows up in India, pregnant, has the child. Word of this comes to Kamaladevi. She's in jail. There's this American woman. She's having an affair with your husband. She's had a child. The husband, it could be your husband's child. We don't know. And Kamaladevi's instinct is to use her networks to get support to this woman and her child, is to find ways to make sure they're taken care of, because she sees this woman as another human being, and she also has a sense of female solidarity. Here's another woman who's been mistreated by a man, and I'm not going to hold that against her. I'm going to find a way to support her and help her. So in many ways, it's one of the moments I think where Kamaladevi's at her best. She's willing to take the principled stance to go to initiate the divorce, but at the same time to not hold any sort of deep lasting grudge. I'm sure she was deeply angry, but she maintains a relationship with Haran, and she finds support for this woman, Rajani Devi. So it's a remarkable moment in Kamaladevi's life that I think shows her courage, her independence, and also the depth of her empathy for other people.
So after she's unshackled, at least officially, from this marriage, she embarks upon a 2-year-long tour of the world. And I think one of the most striking things of Kamaladevi's career that you bring out in this book is her global mindedness. I mean, she was someone who was always writing or thinking about things beyond India and interconnections with India. But for this particular tour, she really, in many ways, does an incredible thing. I mean, she travels around the world just as World War II is breaking out. She travels to Japan, and then in Japan tells people, I'm going to nationalist China, to the capital of nationalist China, to Chongqing, and obviously annoys a lot of a Japanese host for speaking out firstly against Japanese imperialism, and then telling them that she's traveling onwards to the other side of the battle, and meeting people like the Chiang Kai-shek and his wife. But she spends a great deal of time, most of those 2 years, in the United States. And I know in your first book, obviously, Colored Cosmopolitanism, you begin with an episode from this time when she's in the United States, traveling in Louisiana, and is told to vacate a whites-only part of the train, and she refuses, and that in many ways is a symbolic marker for where her sympathies lie. But she develops ties with all sorts of people there, right? She develops ties with feminists. You talk about her ties with socialists, African American leaders. What were Kamaladevi's overall impressions of America? And how did she establish commonalities between Indian anti-colonialism and the various American progressive movements that she encountered? I realize this is another question which you could probably take 3 days again to talk about, but if you could give us a nutshell idea of what this
yes,
dynamic is
of
like.
course. Well, as you noted, this is really how I became introduced to Kamaladevi originally. I was drawn to her because she was one of the most outspoken Indian critics of American racism, and one of the figures from South Asia who formed the strongest ties with African American activists. And that's where my own historical research began. Yeah. Let me take your second question first, which is just how does she forge these ties with different progressive activists in the US? I give her credit first and foremost because she could easily have come to the US solely as a representative of India's freedom struggle and could have focused on talking about British imperialism. And in some ways, that's the easy and safest route. When you're going to a country and you're trying to gain that country's support for your struggle, it doesn't usually behoove you to criticize the country you're visiting, right? I mean, that can defeat the whole purpose. And yet she does. She speaks out. And some of that is just her own fierce willingness to speak out against any injustice that she comes across. But it's made easier by the fact that there are strong networks of solidarity and support that she's a part of, right? So a figure like Nehru, who's another very important and interesting figure in her life, has his own strong ties with progressive Americans of many sorts, African Americans,
Many of the same characters, right?
Many
like
of the
Paul
same
Robeson.
characters, exactly. So there are these interlocking networks of support that Kamaladevi just slots right into, and then helps to expand and build and amplify. And the Americans who are critical of British rule also tend to be the Americans who are critical of American racism, critical of imperialism more broadly, supportive of women's rights. Some people are more strongly supportive of one cause or the other, but there's a lot of overlap in these sorts of communities, and Kamaladevi sort of fits neatly into them. And that to come back to your first question, just about her overall views of the United States, this strongly shapes her views of the United States. And I think she ends up having a view which accords with many American progressives of that day, which is that the United States is a deeply divided country that has tremendous potential as a source of freedom dreams of many kinds, as a place where there is real hope for true democracy, but also as a place that is very far from living up to its own ideals. So Kamaladevi is keenly aware of the failings of American democracy, of American imperialism abroad, and doesn't hesitate to speak out about it. Now, as you noted, she doesn't hesitate to speak out against Japanese imperialism either. And she is relatively open in her criticism of the Soviet Union. Um, that's another key global player that Kamaladevi visits several times. And although she's on the left and is very interested in some forms of, Soviet socialist politics, land redistribution, etc., she's also keenly aware of the dangers of authoritarianism, of the crushing of free speech. So she's someone who's willing to be basically critical of everyone's failings. She's critical of American failings, critical of the Japanese, critical of the Soviets, critical of the British, critical of India and its failings. And this is, I think, one of the marks of someone who is, a true Democrat, right? With a lowercase d, someone who's deeply concerned about advancing the cause of freedom, and is willing to speak out against the failings of any country when that country is not able to live up to its own, democratic aspirations. And her travels reinforce, I think, that awareness that Kamaladevi has, that freedom is a constant struggle, right? That you it's not as if there's any country in the world that has figured it all out. Kamaladevi's aware of the fact that there are real achievements in different places, but that doesn't stop her from fighting against the inequities and injustices in those places.
So one thing that is quite apparent from your book is that there is a major rupture, right, after independence. She's as late as 1947, she's continuing to talk about worldwide events, right? She's talking about French imperialism in Vietnam. She's talking about the beverage plan in the United Kingdom, the National Health Service. She's talking about a variety of different things, and she's involved in refugee resettlement. She's involved in thinking about health insurance, maternity rights. And yet, I think, as you point out in your book, especially after she tries and fails to enter the Lok Sabha in 1951, she, in her own words, leaves the highway of politics to step into the side lane of constructive work, and she narrows her work considerably to, handicrafts, theater, work with, organizations in India that do a lot to generate employment, but she doesn't seem to have that same critical edge to the criticism to her politics that she did, prior to 1947. What happened precisely? I mean, is it wrong to see a major disjuncture, or is it just simply a new phase of her political activism after 47 and 51?
This is a question I struggled with, Dinyar, and I continue to struggle with. And the easy answer is to say it's both. There is a disjuncture, but there's also a lot of continuity. The hard part is figuring out where exactly the continuity lies, where the disjuncture was, and what caused it. Because certainly the second half of her career is profoundly different from the first half. She's, as you said, almost entirely focused on issues of handicrafts and the arts broadly understood. So it's not just handicrafts; it's also, she's very involved in um, you know the performing arts and in drama, in is creating a robust arts world that she hopes will be strongly supported by the Indian state, but not controlled by the Indian state. So she plays a very important role in that. And she continues to write about and speak out about other issues, issues of gender in particular, but to some degree also issues of socialism and class inequity. But with time, she becomes less ferocious in her critiques, both domestically and I think even more dramatically abroad. I mean, this is one of the things that really struck me
And me also reading your book. I
yes,
mean, I
no,
was amazed that she
yes,
didn't
it really,
speak out against, like oppression in Iran or,
that's right.
Mexico, America.
That's right. Yes. So, the fire that she brought with her to her travels in the 30s, and especially the the during the Second World War, that is not there when she travels later in life. Now, she is critical of the World Crafts Council, the organization that she plays an important role in founding and plays a key role in for many years. She is critical of its failures to fully include artists from Asia and Africa, and there is some fire there still in her criticisms of that organization and its failings. But in terms of speaking out against national governments, speaking out against inequities in many of the countries that she's visiting, and she visits so many of them. I mean, she just travels hugely, well into the last decade of her life. She's much more muted, and some of that I think is age, and some of that is just that she has a lot of health problems. She has to focus more on her own world just by necessity. So she ends up with less bandwidth to speak out about other things, and she chooses to use her energy to speak out within the world of handicrafts and arts. um, some of it I think is also just a certain shift in her conception of her role in the world. And it's not a complete shift. There's a couple examples in the last chapter of the book that I find deeply moving, where she does go out of her way to speak up in order to intervene. For example, when the two young boys, the shepherds, wander into Pakistan, Kamaladevi quickly intervenes to bring them back home. When a young woman is the victim of an acid attack, she speaks out and quickly finds support for that young woman. So she still intervenes, and she still has some of that sense that when there's an injustice, she will speak out and remedy it. Another example is the imprisonment of women and children in the wake of the storming of the Golden Temple, right, in Amritsar. So she plays a key role in that as well. So these are all things happening in the 80s, near the end of her life, that she
Mm-hmm.
takes an active stance on. But certainly, it's not the Kamaladevi of the 30s and 40s. Now, I mean, how many of us are going to be the same when we're in our 80s? It's a high bar to say that someone as fiery and radical as Kamaladevi should be expected to remain that way throughout the full course of their life. So for me as a biographer, I tried not to, hold her to an unreasonable bar. But I also didn't want to gloss over the changes, right? Because there are changes there, and it's important to recognize them and be honest about them, even while appreciating the many ways that she remains a very important figure, even in the later parts of her life. And the arts and crafts work that she did, I ended up being deeply moved by. And that's not a part of her world that I knew much about when I came to this project. I came, as we mentioned briefly earlier, through the politics of the 30s and 40s, her fierce opposition to American racism. That was the part of Kamaladevi that I knew going into the project. And I really had to educate myself about the world of arts and crafts. And I came to really appreciate the deep meaning that Kamaladevi had and continues to have for many artists and handicrafts communities throughout India and even beyond. She's still seen as a heroic figure who fought in order to empower people to have a form of life that they could earn money for their families, but also that they could produce their art and share it with the world. So, that second half of the book, it is to some degree one of of a disjuncture, and to some degree of Kamaladevi's increasing moderation on the political front. But there's still a lot of fire in her, and there's still a lot of really important and beautiful work that she does in those years.
And in many ways, it's, I mean, for us sitting here in the year 2024, we might tend to look on handicrafts work as a bit of a niche area of focus. But in that era, as many people have written, I mean, that was kind of considered a major source of jobs generation.
Yes.
Joblessness, of course, as today, back in her era, was a major crisis facing India. And, she did provide a lot of people, especially very poor people in the countryside, with jobs
That's
and
right.
with a modicum of respect as well.
That's right. That's right. And she would have seen it both as as a matter of economic development and as a matter of cultural growth. I mean, for Kamaladevi, these are vital cultural traditions that need to be protected and preserved and expanded and elaborated upon. And this is another part of her life we haven't touched upon that I think is quite remarkable. That, within the arts and crafts movement, there tend to be traditionalists who want to preserve cultural forms, and then there are sort of avant-garde radicals who are creating new forms and experimenting. And Kamaladevi manages to bridge that divide. She's someone who's very interested in preserving and protecting cultural traditions, but also someone who believes that in order to preserve a tradition, you have to be willing to innovate and expand and create new forms. And that's another form of her legacy that I think is important to recognize.
There's one last disjuncture I want to ask you about, which is her relationship with the women's movement and particularly the idea of feminism. So you mentioned earlier that Kamala Devi's views on things like religion and caste could sometimes be a little naive, and this is something that you bring up a bit in the book. But with regards to feminism and women's rights, this is something that she really is a pioneer in the early 20th century, even though she doesn't like the word feminism. She not, as many feminist scholars have mentioned in the work, and as you mentioned in the book as well, she basically is a feminist, even though she rejects that label. Nevertheless, by the end of her life, there seems to be growing opposition um, towards Kamala Devi's views amongst Indian feminists. She was savagely criticized for being too conservative, as I think you mentioned earlier on. Um, how did her relationship with the women's rights movement evolve over time? Was it uh, a fact that her ideas and views didn't age well, or was something more going on over here?
This is a really rich question. I think I should start, just for our listeners, by clarifying why she didn't like the term feminism, because this remains relevant. So her concern with the word feminism was, in essence, that she worried that it communicated a certain narrowness that was anti-male rather than anti-patriarchy, and that tended to prop up issues of gender inequity above all other concerns or causes. And Kamaladevi's view was always that women's rights were bound up with a larger struggle for freedom and justice. And because of that, that women should forge bonds with men who would together fight against sexism and patriarchy, but also against class inequity, caste, other forms of injustice. So her vision for the women's movement is that it's deeply bound up with a range of other struggles. And she worries that the term feminism, which she sees as a Western import, is too narrow and exclusionary and is going to divide women off from this larger progressive struggle. And that remains her concern with the Indian women's movement in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, is that she comes to feel that many younger feminists are sort of hiving themselves off and separating themselves from this larger struggle, and also not recognizing the degree to which Indian women had made certain strides or gains. And here's where, as a biographer, I tried to be fair to her, but also recognize where my own personal views might not align with hers. My own sense is that Kamaladevi, in her later years, does become too rosy a viewer of the state of gender equity in India, and I
It
think,
certainly seems so from how you
yeah,
described the book.
and it's understandable to some degree, right? I mean, I think when you're deeply enmeshed in a struggle and you see a lot of gains, it's easy to amplify them too much and to celebrate them too much and to not recognize what still remains to be done. But there are certainly some examples in Kamaladevi's writings in those later years where she'll say things that just didn't seem to be true, where she exaggerates the success of the movement in ways that a younger Kamaladevi wouldn't. And so for me as a biographer, I try to recognize why she had that viewpoint, where it came from, but also acknowledge its limitations. But I also think that there are, even in those years, there are real important differences that aren't easily resolved between those who want to say, and this cuts across issues of gender to pretty much any cause. When do you say, um, we need to fight for this cause now and forget forging solidarities, or forget forging bridges because we need to stay focused on this one issue? And when do you say, no, we need to build these broader coalitions, but that might force us to water down some of the fire that we're bringing to this one cause in order to bring others in? That's a real difficult struggle. I think Kamaladevi, in her approach to feminism, especially in the end of her life, is really strongly on the side of, let's forge these bridges, let's forge these larger solidarities, let's see the women's movement bound up with all these other struggles. And there are advantages and disadvantages to that way of approaching issues of injustice.
So there are a lot more things that we could talk about with regard to Kamaladevi. We just don't have time to talk about things like her involvement with princely states, her views on things like Goa, her more of her activism with regard to, say, socialism in the 1930s and 1940s in India. The last question I want to ask you is back to our subject of a biography, and addresses you as a biographer. As you note in your book, towards the end of your book, I mean, there have been, in an increased number of biographies about Indian figures over the past few years, but for women, Indian women, the number still remains stunningly, stunningly low. From your own research of Kamaladevi, what other women leaders did you encounter who you believe need biographical treatment, or at least some sort of further scholarly or popular re-examination? What other people in Kamaladevi's life really kind of stood out to you in terms of their importance and their need to be re-examined?
Oh, so there are so many. uh, I mean, maybe I'll start by just saying that you know, there are a couple biographies that are either out or in the works that I think are important. The books are important, the figures are important. So,
Yes.
Manu Bhagwan's book on Vijayalakshmi Pandit, who was a very important figure for Kamaladevi. Um, you know, uh, Pandit and Kamaladevi didn't work super closely together, but their lives overlapped at many key junctures. And Pandit was, like Kamaladevi, a profoundly global figure.
Hmm.
Um, you know,
Of
uh,
course.
so anyway, that's a book that's already out there that I'm glad exists. It's an important one. Rohit Day is working on a biography. I don't think it's out yet. I should have Googled this, but I think it's still in the works, of a biography of Sarojini Naidu. That it will also be published in the Indian Live series that my biography came out on. That's edited by Ramachandra Guha, as you know. So that, obviously, Sarojini Naidu. If I had to choose one other female figure that had a profound impact on Kamaladevi, it would be Sarojini Naidu. And it was a complicated relationship, as we've discussed, but also a really important one. Um, and then, oh my goodness, you know, where to start? I mean, so Aruna Asaf Ali is a fascinating figure who Kamaladevi had some deep animosity with, that I
Hmm.
never fully understood. I know some of the story there, but I think some of it might be that they were too similar in some ways. There's just too much overlap, so they were fighting. Um, you know, um, I think that's a possibility. Um, or even, someone like going to further in Kamaladevi's life, someone like a Pupul Jayakar,
Hmm. Hmm.
who's often held up as a sort of the alternative to Kamaladevi, or the rival, if you will, within the world of Indian handicrafts. If you look at any moment in India's history, you'll find so many remarkable women who are deeply involved in the struggles of that particular moment or that particular day, whose lives we should better understand. And I'll say, I'm really excited because I think that there's there's so many younger historians right now who are at work on different facets of this, and sometimes it'll show up in the form of a biography. But as you know well, biography is a genre that has its own demands and it has its own benefits, but it isn't for everyone. And so even having there's a lot of great books that have come out or are coming out about the Indian freedom struggle in which women play key figures. Even if it's not a biography, it's still an opportunity for us to better understand the role that these various women played. So I think that it's an exciting moment to be a historian who's interested in the role that women played in the Indian freedom struggle, because there's a lot to be done, but there's also a lot that's already being done.
I agree entirely. I'm really happy with the way that the field, so to speak, has developed in terms of much more interest in these characters who have for so many years been left out of the limelight. So, Nico, I'd really like to thank you for joining me today. And your book does a really remarkable job of illuminating a life which more, not just Indians, but I think people around the world should know about, just in terms of her importance, not just to the Indian freedom movement, but to ideas of global importance. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Dinyar. It's been a pleasure.